It started with a photograph. That's how it always starts, isn't it? I was 3 hours deep into a digitized archive of 19th century circus promotional materials, the kind of rabbit hole you fall into when you're supposed to be doing something else entirely, when I found it. A sepia-toned cabinet card circa 1880 from a travelling American exhibition. 2 men in top hats stand at chest level to a third figure. The third figure is not standing on a platform. There is no force perspective trick that I can identify with any confidence. No box beneath his feet. No camera angle that would obviously explain away the proportion. He is simply large. Enormously, unsettlingly large. The caption read, "The celebrated giant, a marvel of nature, or the finest deception in showmanship." And I remember sitting back in my chair and thinking, why are those the only 2 options? Why, in the framing of the era itself, was the dominant cultural script for encountering a very large human being either a wonder of nature or a trick? Why was the hoax explanation so aggressively preloaded into the presentation, almost as if someone needed the audience to choose it? That question lodged in me like a splinter. The deeper I went into the archive, the more that splinter worked its way inward. What I found was not a single curiosity. It was a pattern. A repeating, cross-continental, suspiciously well-coordinated pattern that, once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee. We are told, and we largely accept without scrutiny, that the 19th century circus was a celebration of the exotic, the unusual, and the theatrical. P.T. Barnum's famous maxim, "There's a sucker born every minute," has been so thoroughly absorbed into our cultural DNA that we use it as a lens through which we interpret the entire era. The period was one of showmanship, of deception, of willing suspension of disbelief. That framing is useful, perhaps too useful. Because here is what it accomplishes. It creates a totalizing interpretive framework in which anything encountered within the context of a circus exhibition is, by definition, suspect, staged, performative, the product of padding, stilts, camera tricks, and the gullibility of crowds. The circus was the era's designated space of acceptable unreality. And anything placed inside that space, any body, any claim, any apparently anomalous human form, gets automatically laundered through that framework. Not examined, not documented by independent observers with any rigour, not measured with any transparent methodology. Simply labelled, exhibited, and then, when the tour ended, quietly packed away. This raises a simple but critical question. If you needed to display something real, something whose reality was inconvenient, whose existence disrupted a particular narrative about what humanity was and had recently been, where would you put it? Where would you place it so that curious eyes could see it, so that complete suppression became unnecessary, but so that its implications could be safely neutered? You would put it in the circus. You would call it a wonder or a hoax and let the crowd decide. And the crowd, primed by decades of Barnum-esque showmanship, would almost always choose the hoax. Every time. Let's talk about the giants themselves. Not the legend, not the mythology, but the documented, advertised, receipted, and toured individuals who appeared under circus and travelling exhibition banners across North America and Europe during roughly the 1850s through the 1910s. The names given to them are worth pausing on. Colonel Routh Goshen, the Arabian Giant; Captain Martin Van Buren Bates, the Kentucky Giant; Angus McCaskill, the Cape Breton Giant; Chang Yu Sing, the Chinese Giant; Edouard Beaupré, the Willow Bunch Giant; Ella Ewing, the Missouri Giantess; and dozens more from Sweden, from Russia, from the Ottoman territories, from Brazil, from the African continent. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every continent that had been recently, within living memory, part of the great disruption that some researchers associate with a pre-existing, far older global civilization. Across every region where old maps, old buildings, old infrastructure of contested origin still stands in some form. in every place where the bones of the earth still seem to carry the architectural memory of something that came before the world we were told began. All of them appear fully formed in the exhibition record. Almost none of them have robust documentation of their earlier lives, orphaned histories, vague origins, geographic attributions that shift between promotional materials. Arabian, Kentucky, Chinese, labels of convenience, not biography. And here's the strangest part. When you attempt to trace their lineages backward, to find the family records, the birth documents, the parish registers, the census notations that should, in the increasingly bureaucratic 19th century, exist in abundance, the trail goes thin. Very thin. In some cases, it effectively vanishes. Why? Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not a biologist, I'm not a physician, and I am not going to make definitive claims about what human physiology can and cannot produce. But I am going to note something that the evidence appears to suggest, and I am going to ask you to sit with it. The officially recorded heights of the so-called circus giants of the 19th century cluster in a remarkably narrow band. 7 feet 8 inches, 7 feet 11 inches, 8 feet 2 inches. The most famous cases hover just below or around the 8-foot threshold, with a small number of outliers pushing beyond it. This is presented as the natural upper limit of extraordinary human variation. The medical literature of the era frames it as pathological gigantism, acromegaly, pituitary abnormality. The circus framing reinforced this. Here was a body produced by malfunction, by excess, by nature gone wrong. But consider the skeletal record. Not the circus record, the skeletal record. Reports of excavated remains appearing throughout the 19th century in newspaper accounts from across the continental United States, from Ireland, from Turkey, from Peru, from the islands of the Pacific, describing bones of apparently human morphology at dimensions that exceed the circus-era figures considerably. 9 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet in the most extreme accounts. These reports are almost universally dismissed today on the grounds that they appeared in newspapers, and 19th century newspapers were sensationalist, unreliable, and editorially undisciplined. The official explanation collapses right here for me, on that point alone, because the same newspapers that are deemed too unreliable to transmit accurate skeletal measurements are considered entirely reliable when they document elections, legal proceedings, business transactions, and the statements of presidents. We trust them selectively. We trust them when their testimony confirms the world we expect, and we dismiss them when their testimony unsettles it. Why? Here is where we arrive at something that I find genuinely impossible to ignore, no matter how many times I approach it from a skeptical angle. The campaign to frame large human individuals as circus performers, as entertainments, as pathologies, as hoaxes or marvels, was not an American phenomenon. It was not a British phenomenon. It was not even a Western phenomenon. It was global, simultaneous, and extraordinarily well coordinated for a world that did not have telecommunications. In the 1860s and 1870s, while Barnum's exhibitions were establishing the interpretive template in the northeastern United States, travelling exhibitions with strikingly similar framing were operating in France, in the German states, in the Russian Empire, in the Ottoman capital, in Calcutta, in Shanghai, in Cape Town, and in the cities of South America. Different languages, different promotional traditions, different cultural contexts for spectacle and wonder, and yet the same essential message, reproduced across all of them. This large person is either a natural aberration or an elaborate deception. Choose one. Move along. Not an organized movement, not a conspiracy with named architects, not a coordinated campaign with a paper trail, but a cultural convergence so uniform, so simultaneous, so consistent in its core logic that it demands an explanation. Think carefully about what global coordination in the 19th century actually required. You needed transportation networks, you needed communication infrastructure, you needed institutions, press organizations, scientific societies, governmental bodies willing to adopt and amplify a consistent framework. And you needed all of that to happen organically and spontaneously across cultures that were simultaneously engaged in massive geopolitical conflict with one another. Does that seem more plausible to you than the alternative? That there was something, not a conspiracy, but a shared institutional interest, a shared epistemological need, in making certain kinds of bodies legible only as entertainment. I want to approach this carefully, because this is where the territory becomes most contested, and where intellectual rigour matters most. There is a growing body of researchers working outside of academic institutions, largely self-funded, largely dismissed, who propose that the civilization we call Tartaria, which appears on European maps with striking prominence from the 16th through the early 19th centuries before abruptly vanishing from cartographic and historical consciousness, was not simply a geographic designation for the steppe regions of Central Asia. They propose, with varying degrees of evidence and varying degrees of interpretive restraint, that it was the vestige of something older, a civilization of different scale, different proportion, whose physical infrastructure, the wide corridors, the grand arches, the enormous doorways, the strikingly high ceilings of buildings, we are now told, were constructed by relatively recent populations for entirely conventional purposes, was built for bodies that were not the same as ours. I am not going to tell you that this is true. I am going to ask you to look at the evidence they've assembled and ask yourself whether the official explanation that all of those doors and ceilings and arches were simply aesthetic choices, expressions of ambition, monuments to ego, fully satisfies you. And I am going to ask you to hold that question alongside the Circus record. Because here is what the evidence appears to suggest when you lay them next to each other. In the same decades during which the last of the old architectural world was being demolished, remodelled, or absorbed into new institutional use, roughly 1820 through 1910, a wave of unusually large human individuals appeared in the public record, were immediately absorbed into the entertainment infrastructure, and were systematically framed as either pathological or theatrical. Not political refugees, not living representatives of a displaced people, not the inheritors of a physical tradition from a different era of human history. Freaks or fakes. This is the part that quiets the room. Several of the documented circus giants of the 19th century died in institutional or exhibition, custody, and their remains were retained, not returned to families, not interred with the dignity extended to ordinary citizens. Retained, Edouard Beaupré, the Willow Bunch giant, died in 1904. His body was displayed in a travelling exhibition for years after his death. It was eventually acquired by a university where it remained as a specimen for decades. His family's requests for the return of his remains for proper burial were not honoured for the better part of a century. A university held a dead man's body, a man of unusual physical proportions, as a scientific specimen for a century. I want to ask you directly, what were they studying? What question did his body answer that required continuous possession? What was it about his physical form that made institutional retention preferable to burial? The silence that surrounds these questions is not the silence of incomplete record-keeping. It is a specific shaped silence, the kind that forms around something that certain institutions have collectively decided not to discuss. Once you sense it, that silence becomes its own kind of evidence. Before photography was standardized, before studio conventions became rigidly established, a window existed, roughly 1845 to 1875, during which photographic subjects were captured with relative consistency of scale. The technology was new enough that systematic distortion for commercial purposes had not yet become standard practice. The conventions of trick photography were being invented in real time, and their signatures are often, to a trained eye, detectable. In this window, the photographic record of large human individuals is striking. There are images, I have spent considerable time with them, in which the proportional relationships between subjects are not easily explained by any combination of perspective, platform, footwear, or lens distortion that I have been able to identify. where the geometry of the image simply resists the hoax interpretation. Not in every case, not uniformly, but in enough cases, with enough regularity that the question will not resolve cleanly. And in almost every case, these images were produced for or acquired by Circus Promotion, which means they enter the archive already pre-labelled, already interpreted for us. The caption tells us how to see, and we see accordingly. What would we find, I wonder, if we stripped the captions away? If we looked at the photographs, as light hitting a sensitized surface and recording what was there, rather than as circus ephemera? If we asked not, is this trick convincing? But what would have to be true for this not to be a trick? The circus giant, as a sustained, prominent, repeating exhibition phenomenon, essentially vanishes from the public record in the first decades of the 20th century. Not immediately, not all at once, but with a rapidity that is, I think, worth noting. The early 1900s bring new institutional frameworks, the modern research hospital, the newly professionalized discipline of anthropology, the consolidating authority of national museums and scientific societies. The human body, especially the unusual human body, is gradually transferred out of the exhibition economy and into the scientific one. The circus freak gives way to the medical case study. And in that transition, something closes. The medical case study is a controlled genre. It circulates within professional networks, behind the paywalls of academic journals, within the institutional walls of teaching hospitals. It is not public. It is not available for independent examination. It is interpreted by credentialed professionals and reported in terms that the layperson is expected to accept on authority. Was this transition a natural evolution of scientific practice? Perhaps, probably in many ways, yes. But I want you to notice what it accomplished. It moved the anomalous body from the public gaze to the professional gaze. It replaced the ambiguity of the circus, hoax, or wonder with the closed certainty of the diagnosis. Pituitary dysfunction, endocrine abnormality, case closed, and the photographs went into private collections. The skeletal remains went into storage. The promotional materials were acquired by specialist archives with limited public access. And the people themselves, the living memory of what they had been, of where they had come from, of whether they had stories to tell about their origins that did not match the promotional labels, were gone. Not hidden, not suppressed, simply allowed to become unreachable. I began this investigation skeptical. I remained skeptical of easy answers, of tidy narratives, of the temptation to replace one closed system of explanation with another. But I no longer find the official explanation sufficient. The official explanation that the circus giants were a mixture of genuinely tall individuals with medical conditions and elaborate theatrical hoaxes, all of it absorbed into the entertainment culture of a credulous era, does not account for the consistency of the framing across cultures that had no mechanism of coordination. It does not account for the thinning of biographical records at the precise point where they should be thickest. It does not account for the institutional retention of physical remains, or the migration of anomalous bodies from public exhibition to closed professional custody at exactly the moment when the old world's architecture was being most aggressively demolished and reclassified. It does not account for the fact that the people described in the promotional literature of their own era as the most extraordinary human specimens of the age, individuals whose existence, if taken at face value, would demand a profound revision of our understanding of recent human history, were systematically placed in a context designed to make them unbelievable. Not executed, not imprisoned, not simply hidden, made unbelievable. There is a particular kind of erasure that does not require destruction. It requires only recontextualization. Place the evidence where it will be seen, but frame it so that no one will credit what they're seeing. The circus was, in this reading, not a celebration of the strange. It was a managed disclosure, a space where the otherwise unmanageable could be contained within the safe category of entertainment. And here is the question I keep returning to, the one that will not leave me at 3 a.m. when the archive is open. and the photographs are spread across my screen. If these individuals were simply tall people with medical conditions, if their proportions were pathological, their heights explicable, their bodies entirely consistent with the world, as we understand it, why did the institutions of the era work so hard to ensure that we would never quite believe them? What exactly were we being protected from believing? The evidence does not answer that question. Not fully. Not yet. But the question itself, its shape, its persistence, its refusal to be dissolved by the official narrative, feels like the most important thing I've found in this archive. More important than any single photograph. More important than any measurement. The question that was never supposed to be asked.